Well, I'm sure by now all of you have heard the news of Renee Nicole Good being shot by a ICE officer in Minneapolis. And I'm sure you are also well aware of the incredible polarization and divisiveness that a seemingly self-explanatory piece of, uh, you know, filmed media has produced. I assumed naively that the footage was self-explanatory, and that when I talked to one of my friends about this, it was like a splash of cold water in the face that uh, you know we can't agree on even the most basic things in front of us. I have the perspective that to me seems completely self-evident, um, that she was killed completely unnecessarily. And I've watched the footage several times. I can see that if she were truly a domestic terrorist trying to run them over, she had ample opportunity to do so, and it would have made no sense for her to put the car into reverse, and then drive away, or attempt to drive away before being immediately shot. Um, she turned the wheels. Honestly, I'm not even going to get into all of that because that's not really the point of the video that I'm trying to make here. You'll be able to find endless streams of creators talking about why she was in the right or why she was in the wrong, why the ICE officer was wrong or why the ICE officer was right. I'm not here to debate or discuss that or waste your time with that kind of gossip. What I want to discuss here are the implications of this event, as well as pretty much all of the past, 10 years of political polarization that has been, simmering and growing to a boiling point, not just in the United States, but all over the world, especially, in other similar countries like in Europe, where they're also facing migration issues due to refugees at large scale. And the thing that I wanted to cut to is that I believe that the whole argument over open borders versus closed borders misses the point. You know, on the folks, like I'm an independent. I do not identify with either uh, cheeks on the ass of Uncle Sam. Pardon my French. But I do have a mix of views depending on the topic, because sometimes I'll be discussing something and they'll look at me like, oh, you must be a conservative, or oh, you must be a liberal. It's like, no, I'm just someone who thinks deeply about my own you know interpretations of what's going on in the world, and I come to my conclusions based off of that. I'm not trying to just toe the party line based off of what NPR or Fox News tells me to believe. So forgive me if I sound a little bit heated, but it's frustrating, and sometimes it feels like I'm banging my head against the wall that we still, after all this time, are not getting it. We're still falling for the trap of tribalism. We're still missing the bigger picture. And that is that we are currently in we just passed through the first quarter, and we're into we're beginning the second quarter of this century, which is characterized by an unprecedented polycrisis. It's a term you've probably heard used by the United Nations, the World Economic Forum. It was popularized during the pandemic and the lockdowns, and it very accurately characterizes the world that we live in, which is essentially a world of interconnected crises that, taken in isolation can be overwhelming to try and deal with, like, economic instability or civil war or genocide or, mass migration or the culture wars and all that kind of stuff. But when you zoom out, you realize that they're all connected with each other. It's like a big web that is very difficult to untangle. And unfortunately, a lot of people in government positions, especially in like the United Nations, have begun using the term polycrisis as a way of dismissing accountability for themselves. It's like, oh, well, it's really tough. We haven't been able to figure this out because it's the polycrisis. And so anyway, that's one layer that I wanted to get at. And immigration is just one piece of the polycrisis. Um, uh, I'm a little bit stuffed up, so forgive me if I'm making like snot noises. But basically, If you zoom out a step further, you get the meta crisis, which is essentially the crisis of meaning, the loss of connection to the world. I'm currently making a deep dive video into the latest Avatar movie, Fire and Ash, to discuss this. And some people have called it the crisis of vision. There's a really, really fantastic guy on Substack that I have been following the past several months called Seeing Through the World, and he articulates this crisis of vision very, very well. It's something that I think is incredibly important, because you see the polycrisis, you see all of these different, interconnected issues that are very overwhelming to tackle, and yet you can't really pin down. It's like whack-a-mole. You try and hit one issue and another one pops up. There's not really like a unifying core issue that if you solve that, it would just solve everything else. And part of that is because the polycrisis is a symptom of the metacrisis. The polycrisis emerged in the 21st century because we entered into the metacrisis probably a couple hundred years ago. And that is, it's often called the Enlightenment, which I think is very ironic, considering that we're at the most disconnected, materialistic, individualized, atomized society that we've ever been. And I've said the term metacrisis a lot of times, so I'll break it down in a very simple sentence. The metacrisis is essentially the death of meaning, the death of God, if you will. It is the death of the sacred, and all of the interconnectedness, all of the holistic perspective, like the lived experience that we as humans used to have when everything had a certain depth of meaning and gravity to it. Now it's all just dead, manipulative, or dead matter that is able to be manipulated to our will. There's nothing more to it. And once that happened, all sorts of things just started falling apart. And it's no coincidence that once everything was dead, lifeless matter, the Industrial Revolution kicked off. And now we're dealing with the second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences of, the steam engine, with all of the acidifying oceans and the collapsing ecosystems and all of the catastrophic, ecological crises that are happening simultaneously that the whole CO2 debate often totally overlooks. Like, even just pollution alone is insane to think about. And, the whole scam of recycling, and how that often just gets shipped off to third world countries. It's when you really look at even just the environmental side of things, that in and of itself is enough to make someone, want to wish that all of it was just made up and not true, which I think explains a lot of why people on the right often just dismiss it as hysteria. Because if you were to actually accept that all of that is true, it would be incredibly painful. And they see people on the left getting all hysterical and up in arms about it. They're like, oh, look at you, you're just mentally ill and you've got all of these issues. And it's like, again, they're missing the point. And so I've zoomed out, laid out the metacrisis that's beneath the polycrisis, and now we're going to go back into immigration, specifically what this situation with Renee Good represents. So first of all, I just want to point out, I think it's incredibly ironic that a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman of, likely German or English descent based on her last name, was killed by an ICE officer. I think there's something to be said there. Definitely a lot of cognitive dissonance to have to justify that for people who don't really want any immigrants here. So, taking this into account, why is it that the open borders crowd and the, build the wall crowd are totally missing the point? Well, the problem that both of them are refusing to acknowledge is what's coming downstream in the pipeline for this century, We already have 120 million people across the globe displaced by, famine, war, state collapse, all sorts of things. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is projected to double by 2050. That figure earlier I said about 120 million. To put that in perspective, I think that's about 1 in every 70 people on the planet is displaced currently. And that number is only going up. Then you also take into account that war is on the rise. For the past 5 years, wars have been breaking out more and more frequently. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's long, protracted conflict like what we see in Ukraine. For example, last May, we had an 88-hour war, as it's been, popularly named, between India and Pakistan. It was actually the largest aerial dogfight since World War II. It involved over 120 military jets. It only lasted 3 days, but it's pointing to the fact that these military tensions are rising. And if they escalate to the point, say, for example, in Myanmar, where genocide has been occurring, or in Sudan, we have massive displacement of populations. And so what does that mean for both the open borders and the build the wall crowd in whatever country you find yourself in, whether it's the United States or Poland? Well, it basically shows you that, the number of people that are displaced is only going to rapidly increase over the coming decades. And simply saying, oh, we need to close our borders and, develop a more rigorous, expedited legal process to citizenship, or just saying, let them all in, it doesn't matter. Neither of that acknowledges the fact that our countries, Western European nations, are a very small population percentage of the planet. And yet you have a massive influx of people coming from across the globe to these regions. And what does it do? It overwhelms the infrastructure. It creates political and cultural tension. Jonathan Haidt, the fantastic political psychologist, he found, or I don't know if it was his research or if he was just compiling it. I think it was in the book The Righteous Mind, explaining the divide between the left and the right in the United States. And he found that increased, ethnic diversity in a community actually makes people withdraw. It makes people, isolate into their own little cliques. And the whole diversity is our strength thing. It only works if you have a coherent shared set of values between cultures. And I'm not saying any of this to be, racist or talk down against other cultures. Another angle to look at this is through spiral dynamics by Don Beck. I forget the other guy's name. But if you look at spiral dynamics and you take into account that we have like 8 different stages of developmental psychological states, ranging from basically almost a vegetable, people who have severe learning disabilities or, nonverbal autism, they're just at a survival state. Like their biology is running the show. There's not a whole lot going on as far as abstract thought, moral reasoning, all that kind of stuff. Then you get into tribal perspectives, and then you get into more dogmatic religious perspectives. Or sorry, I skipped one. You get into like very warlord oriented and conflict oriented and conquering, like, Genghis Khan, for example. And then you get to the religious structures and, organized civilization. And then you get to the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, materialism, and individualism. And then, of course, you get to, more ecological oriented, more, love and light, hippie kind of culture. And then eventually you transcend those first 6 and you enter into systems thinking where you finally recognize that there are all of these coexisting, equally necessary stages of human development that all depended on each other to get us to where we are now. You don't, as a 6th grader or, a senior in high school or a PhD in college, look down on the kindergartners and say, oh my God, they're so stupid. I can't believe that they're so, oh, look at those. Like, you'd have to be an absolute idiot to judge someone for being at a lower stage of psychological development. I'm saying that from someone who has watched, this kind of stuff ever since I learned about spiral dynamics back in like 2019. I've been watching it play out in the world. And so it's easy for me to say that, and I recognize that that is, that's a very easy judgmental position to take, but it's also just the tragic reality of the human condition that we're all trying to figure out how to coexist on this planet. And unfortunately, as one of my very close friends said quite often, or says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And I think that we're going to have to swallow that bitter pill in the 21st century, and it's not going to be pretty. And so this is the whole reason why I made this channel, because I feel like there's so much of the conversation that is being missed. Like, it's bigger than just being pro-immigration or anti-immigration. The people that are cheering on the ICE officer or lamenting Renee's death, they're each justified in their own worldview, and I understand why they each go to their own perspective. People on the left, for example, they are very oriented. There's a heavy emphasis on the value system of the care harm principle. That's like the main driver behind their moral reasoning. Whereas on the right, you have there's a much more balanced mix of all 5 different value attributes, such as authority and loyalty and the fairness principle, things like that. I don't remember them off the top of my head. Look into Jonathan Haidt's work; it's incredibly valuable. And I myself, I grew up agnostic. My parents were not religious, so I was told, Republicans are just a bunch of dumb redneck Bible thumpers, and George Bush is the devil, that kind of stuff. I grew up in Vermont. What do you expect? And yet I cannot totally subscribe to the left-wing view anymore. I haven't been like a liberal since 2017. When I attended the Women's March in Washington. That was a very eye-opening experience, being with those tens of thousands of people. But I'm digressing here. The point that I'm making here is that the immigration issue is only going to get worse as the world continues down this trajectory of climate change, whether you attribute it to purely CO2 rise or geoengineering or natural cycles, whatever. I think it's a mix of all 3. Again, we love to find a particular perspective, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, geoengineering, human-caused climate change, or natural cycles, whatever it is, and we love to just stick to that and defend it. And it's like, why? What is the point of rigidly defending an ideological position at the expense of actually solving the problem? And it's the same thing with the gun issue. It's the same thing with, the trans issue. It's the same thing with, Israel, Gaza. Like it's all so tiresome. And yet, I don't think that we should be black-pilled. I don't think that we should fall into the doomer perspective that it's all hopeless and, it's so over. It's like, no, we were born for this. Yes, things are going to get difficult. It's like that meme said, I forget, I think it was from when the Ukraine war started. Hey, I know times are tough. Things are scary right now. But it's going to get way worse. You all know what I'm talking about if you've seen that meme. But that should be invigorating. That should not be a cause for us to wither from life, to draw inwards and, spend all of our time playing video games and numbing ourselves with weed and alcohol. The whole reason I started this channel, Face the Storm, is because the storm is life. The storm is the consequences of our ancestors' actions over the past several centuries. Arguably, you could say that this trajectory started back in the 1500s with the birth of the nation state and the colonization of indigenous European culture, and replacing it with, the whole highly dogmatic religious, and then eventually equally dogmatic about materialist perspectives that led to one of the bloodiest centuries that humans have ever recorded, that being the 20th century. And so I think throwing in the towel right now is not the right move. I think that it is important for us to take stock of what's going on in the world and recognize that a lot of this is completely outside of our control. Hyperfixating on headlines like, Renee and her tragic death, or the oil tanker that was seized by the United States off the coast of Iceland on the same day, or, the capture of Maduro, or any number of other unprecedented events going on. I see a lot of people, my dad's age, he's a baby boomer, and, I live in rural southern Vermont. It is an incredible bubble relative to the world. Like, we have it so easy here. We have it so easy here relative to the rest of the world. And I think that a lot of people, unfortunately, cling to certain luxury beliefs as a result of living in this bubble. One of those being that if you just think good thoughts and you just do the right thing and you just put the right lawn signs outside of your house and, no human is illegal, it's just going to magically solve everything. And Orange Man bad, it's just going to, get rid of Trump and all of our problems will disappear. I got news for you. Trump is not the problem. He is a symptom of the rot. He is a useful idiot for a much larger apparatus of multinational, corporate, technocratic interest that is using him as a means to an end. He's the heel in wrestling. While we're all focused on him doing his whole performance, meanwhile, the fox is robbing the hen house. So, anywho, I meant to say that in reference to how I'm noticing that a lot of boomers are making like New Year's resolutions where it's like, oh, I pray that this year will bring peace and, levity and justice, and I pray that we will be able to solve our problems. It's like, look, you don't get it. We're in civilizational decline. This is a cyclical thing. Like, read Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West. Read Ray Dalio, the I forget what he calls his framework, but this is cyclical. Time is not a linear thing going up here, and you can't just blame one man with a bad orange spray tan and, a tenuous grasp on reality for all the world's problems. That is like Star Wars level political analysis. Like that. I love you, but come on. We can do better than that. And so all of this to say, pay attention to what's going on in the world, but don't get overwhelmed by it. Focus on your local community. Focus on what's actually in your control to change. Focus on your health. Put your own oxygen mask on first. You're not of use to anyone if you're broken, battered, beaten, and demoralized, and you're just dragging everyone around you down into your own pit of despair. You are a liability at that point. And so take a breather, take a rest, get back to it. And I'm saying that as someone who has dealt with, I had a psychotic break back in 2018, which almost destroyed my life. I was vegan for 2.5 years during that time. The psychotic break itself lasted 6 months. And I was told that I was going to be on a medication for the rest of my life that came with incredibly debilitating side effects. I was drooling and almost on the verge of passing out every morning for like a couple hours after I took that morning dose for the first 6 months of adjusting to that medication protocol. I was starting to have severe gut and metabolic issues. And when I got back into the workforce finally, there were times when I would just like black out for a second and drop whatever I was carrying. Like it was serious. It was incredibly serious. And yet I did not take what my doctor said as a, set in stone life sentence. It was hurtful to hear that. But I said to myself, no, I'm going to figure this out. And it took me a while. But with the help of a therapist and the help of, my psychiatrist, nurse practitioner, and even the reluctant support and help of my primary care physician, I was able to taper off of those medications that were absolutely destroying my life after 1.5 years. And I tapered off of them in 2020. And then, like clockwork, my body totally gave way. As soon as I reclaimed my mind and my emotions, my body just shit the bed. The consequences of the medication side effects, as well as the extreme vegan dieting, I was into fruitarianism. Yeah, I know, crazy. Really caught up with me. And even though I was mentally sound and coherent, and I tried going to work for jobs and stuff in the midst of the pandemic when that first happened, I could barely stand for more than an hour or two without excruciating pain in my legs. And, I was on like a local-based, animal-based diet. I wasn't really trying to follow a super rigid protocol. I obviously was not swinging the pendulum to carnivore diet or anything like that. Although I did try it for like a month and then realized, oh, no, I'm not doing this. I'm just going to eat like seasonally and to the best of my ability, follow the 80-20 rule. If I eat some processed food here, that's okay. I'm not trying to be orthorexic anymore. I forgot to mention I had a severe eating disorder during my vegan diet, which, funny enough, disappeared once I started having nutrient-dense food again. So anywho, I had to work with I had to pay out, okay, let me back up a little. I tried going to multiple doctors. I went to, nutritionists. I went to chiropractors. I went to physical therapists. I was trying to figure out why my muscles were not working and why I couldn't, stand without pain. And it wasn't until I went through like 6 or 7 different health professionals covered by my insurance that I said, well, screw this. I need to pay out of pocket for someone who actually is going to get me results. And so I hired a functional nutrition therapy practitioner, an FNTP, with the money from the stimulus check. And I was able to, within just a couple months of working with her, found out that I had severe electrolyte deficiencies, even after a year off of the vegan diet. Excuse me. All this talking is catching up with me. Severe deficiencies as a result of this diet. And that were still lingering with me almost a year later. And I worked with her a couple months. I was able to get back into the workforce full time without pain. It was incredible. It did cost like a couple $1,000s, but it was far more, effective than anything that insurance could possibly cover. And then another thing happened. I got COVID. I got freaked out. I took ivermectin, not even the human grade one. I took the horse paste one. Yep. And I had serious diarrhea as a result of that for 2 weeks. And I also took oregano oil, which likely caused a ulceration in my stomach. And then I went on to a gut cleanse with this same FNTP without informing her of that stuff. Which I really should have at the time. It takes a while for your brain to recover from a vegan diet, and mine was not firing on all cylinders fully. But basically, what happened is that I was able to work again, but then I started having severe debilitating stomach pain for just hours at night. It was agonizing. I was crying because of it. It literally felt like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale in my stomach. And I switched to a new doctor. We started treating it for an ulcer for about an entire year. We treated it like that. I took acid blockers. I even had an endoscopy. There was no ulceration in there. I fired that doctor, hired a new one, and turns out I had Bartonella, which is which is similar to Lyme disease. It's caused by ticks as well as fleas, and it is incredibly disruptive to life. I had it mildly, but it was really bad. I'm going off on a long tangent about this. Essentially, all this to say, I have been dealing with physical health issues for a very, very long time. I dealt with severe mental health issues acutely for a short period of time, but they were so bad that they almost cut my life short or put it on a very different trajectory. And so I'm still here. I'm still moving in the direction of my dreams, despite all the stuff that I'm dealing with in my personal life. You know, I'm caretaking for an elderly dad who is in a walker, who lives in the apartment attached to this house. I'm renovating this house, which is a 200-year-old homestead, on a very, very, very limited budget. And, you know, my dad has been an alcoholic for this entire time, up until he had a very, very serious health scare where he was throwing up blood in September, just before I got married. And so basically, the point that I'm getting at here is that whatever your sob story, whatever it is that you're dealing with, I'm just going to say, like Jocko Willink, good. Then that's what you need to do. That's what you need to deal with. Attend to your life. You know, Jordan Peterson has totally fallen off over the past several years, but his book, 12 Rules for Life, was very helpful for me to recondition myself after being deeply involved in like veganism and New Age and thinking that I could just, wish my way into a perfect reality. And it's like, put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. I know that's a terrible Jordan Peterson impression, but it's true. You can't help anyone if you are not taking care of your life. And so I know that I've made this video quite long, but I think that part of the issue with our current culture, if you've made it this far into the video, is that, we want bite-sized, like 15-second snippets of hot takes so that we can scroll on to the next one, like a dopamine addicted, elderly person at a casino, just constantly, hitting all the buttons on their, I don't even know what those machines are called, but you know what I'm talking about, trying to hit the jackpot, just burning money, but unable to completely. What I'm saying is that if we want to get out of this situation, we have to take stock of our own lives. We have to regain our attention, as I talked about in one of my previous videos, the cost of doom scrolling. And it is so important for us to regain our capacity to communicate with each other. If we're just going to keep reacting to these events like Renee's death in the hyper-tribalized, polarized way that we've been reacting, then whatever we get is what we deserve, because we are putting out into the world exactly what we want. If our behaviors show us that, conservatives are the embodiment of the SS, or, leftists or liberals are the embodiment of the Bolshevik revolutionaries, we're not going to get very far. History is just going to keep on rhyming and rhyming and rhyming, and we're all going to keep scratching our heads as to why things are so awful. So we need to grow up. We need to take responsibility for what it means to be an adult. We need to become mentally coherent. We need to analyze our own thoughts and understand why we believe what we believe, how we come to the conclusions that we have, instead of just having these knee-jerk, emotionally driven, impulsive reactions that we defend to the death. That is, we have to move past that. We have to be willing to accept that there is no perfect solution that's going to make everyone happy, and that there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs. And that's why I made this channel. And so if any of that resonated with you, I'm going to cut it short here. It's time that all of us face the storm together. And I'll see you in the next video.